And if you record to your own device, then you will have the. And Mark, you may, you may want to double check to see if you can record it to your local device now that I've restarted the recording.
It says recording paused. Oh, it's recording now. Maybe.
Yeah,
So Mark,
I keep hitting the recording button and it says
recording on my end. I'm not hitting anything. It's you
yeah, it's
controlling.
definitely, and then it stops.
It's still recording on my end.
Okay, perfect. That's what we want to. Okay, then I'm going to open the waiting room and I'm going to disable the waiting room so that everyone that joins tardy can join. You,
Tracy,
okay,
what's your cell number in case I have to text you or anything?
great idea. It's 253 327 3392.
Tell you what I'll do. I'll go ahead and shoot a text now. That way, if you have to text me or anything as well.
Oh, you're the best. That's great. Okay, we have 15 people in the waiting room. I'm going to let them all in, Mark, and I am going to disable the waiting room.
Hello, Glenn Giffen. I remember having dinner with you when I was at the 2019 4th District Progress meeting in the Panhandle of West Virginia.
So Mark, they're all muted.
Right. I just figured I'd get a word in edgewise.
Good morning, Rosie. You can't.
Whenever you're ready, Gary, I'm ready.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Griffin. I'm an international rep in the 4th District. Today's workshop will obviously be conducted via Zoom. So I would like to introduce Tracy Pruzeau with the IBEW Education Department. She's going to give us a few tips to help today's workshop go a little smoother. Tracy?
Good morning, everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you all today. And several of you have already noted, we have disabled your ability to unmute your audio, and that might change during the course of the workshop, but just to help keep things running smoothly. And before we kick it over to Mark for his remarks, just wanted to orient folks to the Zoom platform. I know you've been on it all week for the progress meeting. The workshop today, the presenter, Mark McDermott, has asked that the interaction happen, get your feedback and your thoughts and your opinions and your ideas using the Zoom chat function. So for most folks, if you're connected on a device that's a laptop, a desktop, or a tablet, the Zoom toolbar is at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see several Zoom tools, including the chat function. If you click on that, you obviously can send messages, you can receive messages. I have uploaded Mark's contact information as well as his social media platforms in the event that you would like to follow him on social media. That document's already loaded in the chat. You can download that information for your records. If you're on an iPhone, the chat function is also, the Zoom toolbar is also at the bottom of your screen, but at the very right-hand bottom corner of your iPhone, it will have 3 dots, a button that has 3 dots. If you click that, the chat function will open up within your, if you're connecting via phone. So if you have questions or aren't unsure of how to use that function, well, raise your hand. You can do that, and I'll try to assist you best as possible without detracting from the workshop itself. So with that, Gary, back to you.
Okay, so let's get started. It's my honor to introduce and welcome back today's trainer, Mark McDermott. Mr. McDermott is a lifelong activist working for economic, racial, and social justice and peace. He retired in 2010 after serving as the regional representative for U.S. Secretary, excuse me, Hilda Solis for the 8 Pacific Northwest and Northern Plains states. He's a full-time economic justice and labor educator. Over the past 9+ years, he has given over 490 speeches and interactive workshops for affiliates of 27 international unions, labor councils, and progressive community-based organizations in 28 states. He has presented to 120 apprenticeship programs, reaching almost 6,500 apprentices. He donates all of his speaking fees to progressive organizations and candidates and people in need. Mark is happily married to his wife, Diane, a lifelong UFCW leader, and loves playing with his 3 grandsons, 9-year-old Walter, 3-year-old Nash, and 1-year-old Hayes. When Mark grows tired in our struggles, wanting a better future for his grandchildren and all children, it keeps him fighting for a better future for everyone. His 3 grandsons remind him that children are born to love, but must be taught to hate. So please welcome back Mark McDermott. Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Gary. Let me just take a second here, and I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. Great. Well, let's get started. First, I want to thank International Vice President Gina Cooper for the opportunity to present again today. As Gary said, I presented to 200 of you in one of the closing plenary sessions at your progress meeting in the Panhandle of West Virginia in 2019. I want to stress the importance of what Tracy is going to be doing here today. She is going to serve as your eyes, ears, and voice. She's going to be tracking the chat box very carefully and summarizing and synthesizing what you were saying, what you're putting in, so that she and I can have a discussion back and forth with her being your spokesperson, if you will. There's going to be 3 interactive exercises during this presentation. So please be involved. Your input is important because it helps me improve the work that I do, as well as leads to a more robust discussion and learning experience for all of you. And let me spend a couple of minutes and tell you, why did I develop this workshop? Since January of 2016, after Donald Trump had announced he was running for president, I did about 225 events in 25 states across the country. Increasingly in those events, participants would get up and say the following: Brother McDermott, my brother-in-law has gone nuts. He's talking crazy stuff about politics. He makes no sense. I've got union members that I work with that it's like talking to a robot. They parrot these conspiracy theories for which they have no evidence. And when I try and present facts, it's like bouncing off a steel wall. Our last Thanksgiving dinner turned into a screaming match, and we're not going to Christmas dinner. And they were saying they were making these comments in anguish and in pain of like their personal lives and their work lives, and in some cases their union lives, were getting more and more difficult, and were pleading with me, what do I do? Well, I started giving them answers, and I realized my answers are inadequate. The one thing I always said was, I never changed anybody's hearts or minds by calling them a stupid, ignorant bigot and doing it out of anger. And I felt that at times. And then I would ask people to raise their hands if they ever felt that way. And people started raising their hands. Yeah, I want to say that. And I said, well, definitely don't do that. And so this workshop has been developed in response to the growing requests that I've gotten from across the country to help us figure out, how do we become more effective in telling the truth to people in ways that they can hear them, in ways that will open up their hearts, which will then help open up their minds to a more civil and calm discussion about what is going on and what do we need to do to make things better. So I would ask you, as we go through this workshop and afterwards, if you've got ideas about how to improve this workshop, put them in the chat box. Okay, this is the way I improve my work, because I'm starting to take this workshop across the country. This is the first of a 2-part series. This describes the problem of disinformation and propaganda. The second one, which I'm still working on developing, is about how do we become more effective in countering it. So let's get started with the presentation itself. First of all, what are we going to talk about today? Let's celebrate the victories that we've had in the last year that were really important. We've got huge opportunities in front of us. We have enormous challenges. We can't pretend that we don't have both. Let's talk about, what is disinformation? Where did it come from? And I'm going to be using the term disinformation, and sometimes I'm going to use the word propaganda. In my mind, they are indistinguishable. So if I use one or the other, I'm still talking about the same thing. Another thing I want to talk about is the long history of corporate America and their allies figuring out ways to divide and conquer the American people by getting us to hate each other and fight each other and focus on our differences rather than our common ground. I want to specifically talk about the disinformation wars and propaganda against voting rights, which has been going on now for several decades. And then last but not least, I at least want to open the door to the question about, how can we win people back to the truth in a civil and non-confrontational way, so that we can have more effective dialogues and find our common ground and move forward to create a better America and a better future for all of us. That's what we're going to do today. So, but first of all, I want to practice the chat box for a second. How many of you in the last 3, 4, 5 years have had frustrating moments talking to people where they're just talking what feels like political crazy talk to you that doesn't make sense and doesn't seem to be backed up by any information? And it sometimes becomes angry. If that's happened to you, would you just go to the chat box and type in yes? Then I'm going to ask Tracy to report out when we get to our first break. But let's just sort of warm up our chat fingers here for the day. So what victories? In 2020, we had the highest percentage voter turnout in the presidential election in 120 years. We elected a pro-union president in Congress, and we have some huge opportunities now to push through major pieces of legislation that are going to improve our rights as workers and strengthen our right to organize, as well as jobs programs that can be helpful to people across the country. We expanded voting rights, and we defeated endless efforts to try and make it more difficult for people to vote, which I'm going to be calling voter suppression. We won 60 lawsuits that said that the election was fair and was conducted legally without widespread voter fraud. There was enormous solidarity across states. In Washington state, where I live, most of the people I knew were making phone calls or sending texts or emails or writing letters to Georgia and Florida and Texas and other battleground states, because we couldn't go there to help because of the pandemic, but we wanted to help. And money came from across the country to help in these key battleground states. And last but not least, we won 2 huge victories in the US Senate in Georgia in December of last year, which gave us the possibility of passing major progressive labor legislation and voting rights legislations in the 2021 and 2022 Congresses. Huge victories. We should celebrate this, but we can't rest on our laurels. On one side of this picture, people are talking about expanding voting rights, and on the other side of the picture are angry people yelling about the elections are being stolen. We have incredible tensions in our country, and I'm sure that you're all experiencing that where you live and where you work, and perhaps even inside of your own local unions. So how do we move forward? We have to defend and expand our voting rights so that everybody has an easy opportunity to vote. We got to fight for the truth, but we got to do it in a loving and civil way, not with anger, because we can't move people with anger. We may defeat them in an argument, but we don't change their heart or mind. We've got to bring civility back to our political discourse. Can we learn to disagree without being disagreeable? Can we learn to do that without calling each other names and dismissing you as you're pathetic or whatever? We've got to combat the endless efforts of divide and conquer, to pit working people across the country against each other. And last but not least, we need to understand and defeat disinformation. This last one is really tough. So let's take a look at where we are at the moment. The 2020 election was extremely close. If you remember, in 2016, Donald Trump won 3 states, which gave him the presidency, by 77,000 votes: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Joe Biden in 2020, even though he won by 7 million votes in the popular vote, in the 4 states that swung it, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, and 1 congressional district in Nebraska, he won by 65,000 votes. So the election, in terms of the Electoral College, was actually very, very, very narrow. So the fact that we have an opportunity to move forward here, we need to bear down and focus and be smart and strategic. As Gary quoted in my short biography, I always use this slide. Children are born to love, they have to be taught to hate. And my 3 grandkids, they're not walking around hating people, okay? They want to love people, they want to be loved. And let's keep that in mind as we go through this story today. In August of 2012, Lindsey Graham, who's a senator from South Carolina and also ran for the presidency, he said, and I quote, "We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term." You said what? We're not generating enough angry white guys? Is your goal to generate angry white guys? Really? Think about this. And in April 2020, with the pandemic raging, and the fight is on in Georgia to say, can we all get absentee ballots so we can be safe from the pandemic? Look what the Speaker of the House in Georgia said. This will be extremely devastating to Republicans and conservatives in Georgia. This will certainly drive up turnout. So if we increase the number of people who are going to vote, it's bad for you? Well, isn't the normal response that you should then change what you're doing so people would want to vote for you, not make it more difficult for people to vote or threaten their health by making them stand in long lines during a raging pandemic? And Lindsey Graham again, 4 days after the election was over. If Republicans don't challenge and change the US electoral system, there will never be another Republican president elected again. Okay, very clear. They got to do something to change things. What are they going to change? Well, they're going to make it more difficult to vote, called voter suppression. And they're going to claim it's based on widespread voter fraud, for which they do not present any meaningful evidence. So let's look at how this actually plays out in Georgia. Following up on what the Speaker of the House said in April of last year, this is December 8th. This is the Georgia Senate Republican Caucus official statement. You can go to their website and read this. As soon as we may constitutionally convene, we will reform our election laws to secure our electoral process by eliminating at-will absentee voting, AKA make it more difficult to vote. Very clear, very direct. There's nothing ambiguous about this. And then what happens in January 5th? I had the month wrong. It was January, not December, that these elections were finalized. These two brothers got elected with strong labor support and gave us a 50-50 tie in the US Senate, which gives us an historic opportunity to make positive changes. So Ralston was correct. Speaker Ralston was correct. In April, he said, hey, if we allow this to happen, this is going to be bad for us. Yeah, more people turned out in a huge turnout, and they lost these two key elections. And again, I go back to the idea, if more people vote and they're not voting for you, then you should be thinking about, are the policies that we're pushing the right ones that will win people to our point of view? Okay, not let's make it more difficult to vote. So the next day after this historic election in Georgia, we have the storming of the US Capitol. Whether you want to call it a riot or insurrection, I don't want to get into that discussion. But I use the quote, do we have enough angry white guys now? And Rudy Giuliani said, let's have trial by combat. Trial by combat, that is from the 14th century in the Middle Ages, where knights would get on a horse and charge at each other with all this armor and a lance and try and knock somebody off and then kill them with a sword. That's trial by combat, and whoever wins is the one that won the case. I think we've advanced beyond that in the past 700 years. Okay? We have a troubled America right now, and I think you all know this. So let's do our first interactive exercise. How are you feeling about our great victories and the state of our country, and where do you find hope? Why don't you take a couple of minutes and type in a couple of ideas, put them in the chat box, and then I'm going to ask Tracy, and I will have a dialogue back and forth for 3, 4, 5 minutes of what are you thinking, what are you feeling at this moment in time?
So Mark,
Yes.
just for your information, 62% of the participants experience having those challenging conversations or are frustrated by comments made by others.
Okay.
And now we are starting to see some answers in the chat box. Brother Tom Connor, I find hope that there will possibly be a labor-friendly National Labor Relations Board. Brother John Boyd says that he is optimistic and proud to be a Democrat.
Okay. Other comments that are coming in?
Yeah, Brother Shane Ferguson says he's feeling good now. How do we get people to buy in? Sister Linda Wenzel, excuse me, is saying, I'm still anxious but hopeful because of the wonderful changes that are developing.
Good.
Few more. Brother David Bruce, I feel good about our victories. However, I also feel that so many things over the past administrations have been forced upon us. I believe it is our time to force more pro-labor friendly policies for American workers. Brother Glenn Griffin, I'm hopeful we are past the rough trials of this country. Brother Ken Kurtz, feeling optimistic also. Brother Scott Smith, hopeful but very concerned about what could happen in 2022.
Okay. So Tracy, if I could ask you, any thought that you might want to share for just a second? Where do you find hope?
Yeah, thank you for that. I will just say that I was probably just like everyone else that's attending this Zoom conversation. I was incredibly anxious about the 2020 election and what was possible, given what happened in 2016. I was overjoyed at the outcome, and I every day talk to folks who are relieved that we have elected a president and a vice president who are interested in governing and helping the American public and are not causing disruption and hate and discontent at every turn.
Great. Okay. Any other comments in the chat box before we move on?
Yeah, we have two more.
Good.
From James, Brother James, I feel very good about our victory, but fearful that the GOP has gone so far over the cliff that this climate of division will become deeper. The big lie continues. And from Brother John Epperly, hope lies in younger generations. They don't seem to buy into the divisiveness and are pro-union.
Good. Well, thank you, Tracy, and thank you for all of your comments. So there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of optimism. There's obviously concern, probably some level of anxiety about, are we going to continue to move forward or are we going to slip backwards? But let's at least celebrate our great victories and remember that we didn't get here without an incredible amount of dedicated hard work by tens of thousands of IBEW members and union members and our allies all across the country. Nothing good in this country ever came easy. So let's talk about the division. At the end of January, a national poll asked the question, was Joe Biden's victory legitimate? Well, 2/3 of the American people said yes, but you can see the difference between the Republicans and Democrats. It's like they're living on a different planet. Okay. And independents had about the same level of belief that the victory was legitimate as the overall population. So very deep division. And I've not seen any evidence that these numbers, the gaps have shrunk much in the last 3 months. So how can this be that people are experiencing the same reality in such a very different way? I argue it's decades of disinformation campaigns, the endless telling of big lies, the endless claims of stolen elections, and this widespread voter fraud for which no meaningful evidence is ever shown. So let's talk about disinformation. I'll call it propaganda. First, you manipulate people through their emotions, not through their minds, through their emotions. You want to use it to divide people, to create divisions, hatred, hostility. It allows the wealthy and the powerful and their political allies to stay in power. It makes it more difficult for people to determine what is true. It makes it more difficult to figure out what is true, let alone find the truth. And it also undercuts the labor movement and other movements that are fighting for economic, racial, and social justice and voting rights in our country. So let's be playful a little bit. Let's start with mass manipulation of emotions. Okay, we got Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Okay, I firmly believe that Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny do not exist. I can't prove that, but I hope everybody in the webinar would agree with me that it's probably very unlikely that they're real. But we tell little kids these stories. They feel good. And I promise I won't tell your kids or grandkids that Santa Claus and Easter Bunny don't exist. So we play with people's emotions in harmless ways. But then there's the manipulation of emotions for profit. Marlboro, the Marlboro man. Marlboro's early on was a woman's cigarette, and it was liberating for women to be able to smoke. Okay, well, you feel like you're liberated, and now you're going to eventually die from lung cancer. How many thousands of women died in part because of the advertising campaigns that said that smoking Marlboros is going to be good for you? Okay. So we live in a country, in a world where there is mass manipulation of emotions for money, for play, but also for political purposes. So George Santayana, who's one of my favorite this is one of my favorite quotes: those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Those who do not remember their past are condemned to repeat their mistakes. Okay, so if we don't know our history, and we don't know the history of where disinformation comes from and how it works and what its purposes are, we are ill-equipped to confront the very challenging situations that we have today in our workplaces, in our unions, in our families, and in our communities, in our churches, wherever we interact with folks. So let's go through a quick history. First of all, you got to manipulate the thoughts and feelings, people. You tell lies, big lies, over and over and over again. You create a big fear or multiple fears. There are endless enemies who threaten us that we need to be protected from. We need to get those people. It produces an enormous amount of anger that never ends. We get around the press, we get around experts, so that we can't have people who are professional truth tellers or professional fact checkers raising their hands going, that's not true, that's not true. You want to get directly to the people and not have intermediaries who are challenging what people are claiming in disinformation and propaganda campaigns. And then, as I said, exhaust our ability to think and to annihilate the truth. So let's walk through these very, very quickly in a short history lesson here. Edward Bernays wrote a book called Propaganda in 1928. He's an American. The opening sentence in the book: the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. If you don't get anything else out of this workshop, I hope you remember this quote. This is 93 years ago, okay? And he is called the father of modern public relations, okay? The Nazis studied him. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda. If you tell a big lie, if you tell a lie big enough and keep people repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The truth is the mortal enemy of a lie. Okay, boom. The lies have to be big, and you keep hammering and you never back down. Hermann Göring, number 2 in Nazi Germany. It is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along. That's easy. All you have to tell them, they are being attacked. You are under threat. You are under siege. You need to be safe and be vigilant against the enemies who are going to destroy us. Based on big lies in the case of Nazi Germany. So what did they do? This is a famous quote of Martin Niemöller, who was a German theologian under the Nazis. And he said, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then the socialists, didn't say anything. Then the trade unionists, then the homosexuals, then the gypsies, then the Jews. And then one day they came for me, and there was no one to speak for me. Well, the lesson of Nazi Germany is the first group that gets attacked. When they said nothing and encouraged the Nazis to step up the big lies and the endless angers and the endless blaming. And so finally, it is directed most severely at Jews and other enemies. I don't need to tell you the story of Nazi Germany. They're rounded up, millions are killed. Because the Jews and the big business people and other traders within Germany had sold them out in World War I. That was the big lie. And they're trying to do it now, aided with their communist allies in Russia. And they hammer away and they hammer away, and they destroy democracy in Germany and become the masters of propaganda. This is a very important point. Albert Speer was one of the top Nazis. And he said, we were the first dictatorship which made complete use of all technical means. Through devices such as the radio and loudspeakers, 80 million people were deprived of independent thought. How did they do this? When the Nazis came to power, radios were very new. The Nazis mass-produced cheap radios. I can't pronounce the name of it in German. Okay, and they sold them so that in a few years, the vast majority of German families had a radio. Well, there aren't very many stations. And guess what? There is a Nazi station that you can listen to every day. And so every day, Hitler or Goebbels or Goring can come into your living room and talk to you personally and your family without intermediaries and say whatever they want. And there's no one on the radio on that station saying, but that's a lie, and that's a lie, and that's a lie. But we have a personal connection with the great leader who's going to make us safe from these endless enemies who threaten our way of life. They also used the loudspeaker and airplanes so that they could fly around the country and hold mass rallies with 100,000 people. And I want you to keep in mind this issue of using new technology to bypass the press and overwhelm the truth when we think about 2020 and 2021. This is a huge point. They were geniuses at harnessing this new technology. Back to Goebbels. This is a rally, by the way, at Nuremberg, where they're using the loudspeakers. They're using the big lie, the endless enemies. Propaganda works best when those who are being manipulated are confident they are acting on their own free will. Okay? These are direct quotes. These are the masters who developed this system, building off the foundational work of Edward Bernays and some other Americans. Okay? I'm not making these quotes up. These quotes are in plain sight. Now let's rush forward to modern day Russia and Putin and other authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes. This is Garry Kasparov. He's a famous dissident in Russia, former world champion chess player. And he says the point of modern propaganda isn't only to misinform or push an agenda, it's to exhaust your critical thinking, to annihilate the truth. I am bombarded by so much information, or what is allegedly information. My head is about ready to explode. I can't figure this out. Who should I believe? How do I figure out what the truth is when I'm being endlessly bombarded? And we certainly experience that today with the internet. Now, wait a minute, Mark. Let's not get carried away. Isn't propaganda and disinformation only run by Nazis, communists, and dictators? Okay, wait a minute. You're making this up. Am I engaging in disinformation and propaganda here? Okay, it's a legitimate question. Am I manipulating you, or am I telling you the truth? So let's talk about disinformation campaigns in our own lifetimes in the United States. And I'm going to warm you up. Number one, cigarettes don't cause cancer. Now, if you're old enough to remember this fight, I am. It took decades to finally overrun the propaganda that cigarettes don't cause cancer. Climate change is not man-made or real. Trickle-down economics is good for workers. Okay, I've got you warmed up. Now, go to the chat box and write down one or more disinformation campaigns that you've lived through or heard about, and let's list them. And then I'm going to ask Tracy to give me, we'll have a discussion of what did you come up with? What other disinformation or propaganda campaigns have you lived through? Why don't you go and start to add a few in? And I've got a few more, if we can fill in the blanks.
All right, it's starting to heat up in here, Mark.
Okay.
I've got Biden and Clinton are eating kids.
Okay, that's the cannibal QAnon theory.
Yeah. Masks cannot prevent the spread of germs.
Okay,
The election was rigged.
okay,
COVID is a hoax. COVID vaccines make you infertile.
Okay.
Marijuana is a gateway drug, and video games cause children to be violent. Pizzagate, which I will expand on if people don't know what that means. Right to work, repeal of prevailing wage. Dems took prayer out of schools. Right to work laws equals more jobs. All incredibly valid examples of what you were asking for.
Okay. Why don't we let people have a little bit more time? I've got a list from a previous workshop that I'm going to read a few of them just to sort of add to this list. If there are no more, anybody else want to add something in the chat box? Let me read a few more that came from a workshop that I did in March. Tax cuts for the rich will pay for themselves. Climate change isn't real. Baby formula is healthier than breast milk. Taxing the rich destroys jobs. Global warming is not human caused. Immigrants are taking your jobs. Getting a suntan is healthy. Vaccines have trackers in them to follow you around. Right to work is about freedom of work. Trickle-down economics, okay, which we mentioned earlier. Corporations are the job creators. Immigrants are stealing our jobs. Raising minimum wage is bad for small business. Masks don't work. The COVID-19 vaccine has a tracking device in it. I've got another couple of pages here.
Yeah, and Mark, we've got a couple more.
Okay.
You have more in common with someone of the same race as opposed to someone of the same economic class.
Okay.
Everything wrong with this country is the Democrats' fault. And lastly, pretty much anything from the National Rifle Association.
Okay. Now, I would argue that many of those are parts of disinformation campaigns. And let me give you one more that it just popped into my mind. The Evergreen Freedom Foundation, which I know Tracy is familiar with because it's based in Washington State. It is an anti-union, union-busting foundation. And I will quote the director of it, and he said, every ill in society can ultimately be tracked back to the abuses of organized labor. So the reason for this exercise here is to get people thinking about the bombardment that we are constantly experiencing of this is allegedly true, this is allegedly true. We're hammered with this over and over and over again. And it makes it hard to figure out what the truth is. And it ramps up anger and fear. So let's move on to the next section. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of corporate backed, supported, and encouraged divide and conquer tactics in our country, and then linking it to voting rights. So let's go to the 1930s and the 1940s when we built our powerful labor movement during the Great Uprising in the 1930s that I talk about in other workshops that I've done. W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the NAACP, said, probably the greatest and most effective effort toward interracial understanding among the working masses has come through the trade unions. Okay. He didn't say that racism and racial division was all gone. In fact, there were still some unions that weren't allowing African Americans to be members. But he was saying relative to any other movement, labor was helping to build more unity and more solidarity across our differences, seeing our differences as positives and not negatives, and not things to be feared. So let's look at the opposite point of view. This is Vance Muse, who is one of the founders of the National Right to Work movement. This is from the 1940s. From now on, white women and white men will be forced into organizations with Black African apes, whom they will have to call brother or lose their jobs. You couldn't ask for two more extreme examples. An African-American leader who had been critical of labor because of its exclusionary policies at times is saying they're leading the charge to help build unity and solidarity. And then you've got a corporate-backed white guy from Texas who's saying we have got to drive the wedge of racism and hatred of people who are different than us, whoever us is, as a way to weaken this labor movement, which for the first time in American history has become very strong and very powerful. Now, boom, we're in the 1960s. We have the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the rise of the environmental movement. There are other movements, students and seniors and people with disabilities. And they're saying we want to be full partners and full citizens in our country. And clearly we want to have voting rights, which they had been systematically denied for decades. So this is a very tumultuous period, but then let's take a look at what some of the political leaders are saying in response to this upsurge in activism across the country. And I would add, there was also a big wave of strikes in the 1960s, as well as the rise of public sector unions, in which they grew from 400,000 to 4 million between the late 50s and the mid 1970s. This is an advisor for President Nixon. Voters are basically lazy. Reason, or thinking, requires a high degree of discipline. You have to work at it. The emotions are more easily aroused. Okay, so if people don't take the time and energy, or are discouraged, or don't feel competent to do good reasoning and thinking and analysis, get them focused on their emotions, stir up the emotions. And his vice president, Spiro Agnew, who resigned in disgrace, how's this for a quote? Dividing the American people has been my main contribution to the national political scene since assuming the office of vice president. There is nothing ambiguous about this statement. My job is to split up the American people, not the United States, but the divided states. Okay? These divisions we're having are not accident, and they didn't just start. Well, what's one of their major goals? This is from Business Week. This is part of the origins of the trickle-down economics that Ronald Reagan and his advisors would push in the 1980s. It will be a hard pill for many Americans to swallow. The idea that doing with less so that big business can have more. Nothing in modern economic history compares to this selling job. Whoa, help me out here, people. What are we living in 47 years later? Where the wealth and the income is roaring to the top and tens of millions of working people are barely keeping it together. Look at this quote. This isn't some kind of an accident. And why would the majority of Americans agree to a change in how our economy works so that the wealth is all flowing to the top and a rising tide no longer lifts all boats? Well, you better have a good propaganda and disinformation machine. And you also got to attack voting rights. So Paul Weyrich from the Heritage Foundation, which is founded by billionaire and multi-million-dollar millionaires' money, very clear. I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. What is more basic in our country than we want everybody to register, to study the issues, learn what the candidates say, learn what the parties say, go to the polls, make an informed vote, and then vote them out if they don't do their job. That's the foundation of our country. It should be. And he's saying, we want fewer people voting. Well, David Ralston, the Speaker of the House in Georgia in April of 2020, he is mouthing the words of Paul Weyrich 40 years later. So in the 60s, with the Voting Rights Act passed, there was a provision that said states and localities that have a long history of discrimination against people of color in terms of their rights to vote, if they want to make a change to their state or local voting laws, they have to get prior approval from the Department of Justice. That was struck down in 2013. Okay. But before then, over a 25-year period, the department blocked over 700 proposed changes. And the Republican-controlled Congress, and I emphasize the Republican-controlled Congress, acting in a responsible way, found that a majority of these changes were calculated decisions to keep minority voters from fully participating in the political process. These are all direct quotes. They can be found. And we can pull out of all of this disinformation an essence of, wait a minute, 700? Are you kidding me? And then the Supreme Court in 2013 says, we don't need this law anymore. It's not valid. And we've had an avalanche since then. So let's look at this voter fraud. This didn't just start. In 2001, John Ashcroft, who lost his US Senate election in Missouri in 2020 to a dead man, in 2000 to a dead man, Mel Carnahan, who died 3 weeks before the election in a plane crash. He lost to a dead man, okay? He says votes have been bought, voters intimidated, and ballot boxes stuffed, okay? And then in 2008, Palin is saying, we always knew the Obama-Biden Democrats will do anything to win, okay? So they're building up the momentum. Now, let me show you something that makes Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny look silly. There was an organization in the country that used to be called Acorn, and it was a grassroots organization that encouraged people to register to vote, gave them voter education, and then encouraged them to turn out and vote. Okay, and there were there were endless accusations that they were doing they're doing their work illegally. There were 45 federal and state and local investigations that cleared them of illegal wrongdoing. They shut down in 2010. Okay, they don't exist as of 2010. In 2008, 52% of Republicans polled said they believe that Acorn helped steal the election. Now, the organization disappears in 2010, and in 2012, 49% of Republicans believe that Acorn was stealing the election. The organization doesn't exist. How in the world could anybody who is thinking rationally and looking for accurate information could conclude that an organization that does not exist is stealing an election? Man, the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy better get out of the way. Okay, because Acorn is doing a hell of a job now that they don't exist. This would be funny if it wasn't so serious. Okay, this idea of the big lie is not new. And endless enemies is not new. It's being used oh so effectively. So with the Supreme Court decision that struck down the voting rights provision of pre-clearance, it made it easier. All these lightly colored states by 2012 have made it more difficult to vote. And the red ones happen by 2016. Most, but not all of these states are also right to work states, I would point out. There's an overlap here. You take away voting rights at the ballot box, and then at the same time, you make it more difficult for people to have a union, to have a voice on the job to a democratic election. So let's look at how this is working today. Here we are in 2020, Steve Bannon. To come back to our 6 themes about disinformation and propaganda. The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. Pardon my language, it's a direct quote. So just pour endless disinformation and lies into the public space and overwhelm the media. Okay, I didn't make these quotes up. Now let's get to Mr. Trump in 2016. He says, after the election, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. He never presented one shred of evidence. Zero. 3 to 5 million unauthorized immigrants voted for Mrs. Clinton. Now we have an enemy. We've got a big lie, told repeatedly, and now we've got an enemy to hate. It's those rotten, undocumented immigrants who are wrecking America. I would also argue it plays into whipping up racism. So the impact of the big lie. This is what Trump says when he's confronted by reporters about you're not providing any evidence about this stolen election. You know what is important? Millions of people agree with me when I say that. Think about this for a minute. He didn't say, this is the truth and I can prove it. He said, I've gotten millions of people to agree with me. That's what's important. Oh my gosh, what happened to the truth? Okay, so the big lies are being told. These are the kind of impacts we get. Now let's drill down into 2020. In the year 2020, Trump tweeted over 100 times, mail-in ballots will lead to massive electoral fraud and a rigged 2020 election. Endless, and over and over and over and over and over. This is straight out of Nazi Germany. This is straight out of Edward Bernays. And this is in a democracy, not a totalitarian dictatorship. But let's look at the evidence. Before 2020, there were 5 states that primarily used mail ballots, including Washington State, where we've been using it for a year, and Tracy and I both live in Washington State, and we're used to, we get our ballot 3 weeks ahead of time. We get a state-provided voter pamphlet with statements from every candidate who's running so we can study it, and then we have 3 weeks to decide who we want to vote for. We put it, now we don't even have to have a stamp, we just put it in the mail and boom, off it goes. Colorado does it, Hawaii, all 5 of these states. And I would point out Utah is an extremely conservative Republican state. This is not just Democratic states having done this in years past. We have high turnout in our states, in these states. There has been no voting fraud scandals since these states made these changes. So if we've had this system in place in multiple states for multiple years, you'd think that the people who are arguing of widespread voter fraud would say, well, look at what happened in Oregon or in Utah. Well, they don't present any evidence because there isn't any. But the truth is the mortal enemy of the big lie, as Goebbels said. This is the truth. So then repeating the big lie. This is Trump again in 2020. I won this election by a lot. Watch for massive ballot counting abuse. Remember, I told you so. Okay, well then I assume there must be some evidence for this. But where is the evidence? Now, we've got people fearful. We've got endless enemies. I just put together a big long list of people who fit varying categories of the enemies we're supposed to worry about. But let me just read them. People who are stealing elections, mask enforcers, Muslims, undocumented immigrants, violent Mexican drug dealers, rapists, and murderers who are pouring across the border, lesbians and gays, transgenders, bisexuals, unions. You know, unions are wrecking America. I'm sure you've heard this a number of times. The people who wanted to fund the police, women, haters of religious freedom, people who are stealing your right to own a gun, the press and the media, environmentalists, the tree huggers. I'm sure we've heard about this. Liberal elitists and violent people of color. And I probably could add a few more to the list. But I just use this as an example of, depending on the issue you want to push with this information, you put these people, one of these or more of them, as the primary enemies that people should be afraid of. So now let's get to the endless anger and fear. Well, my head was about ready to explode during the counting of the votes, you know, last November and December, where at some places you had people yelling, stop the count. And then in other places they're saying, count the votes. And it's like, well, which one is it? I mean, okay, endless anger because the elections are being stolen. There's widespread voter fraud. I know you're all aware of these stories to varying degrees. But let's talk about the new technology of social media. I showed you the quote from Albert Speer from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The radio, the loudspeaker, and the airplane as the major tools. Today, it's social media. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's Instagram, and then there's a bunch of other things that I don't even know what they are. And I don't even know how to, I wouldn't know how to use them if they fell out of the sky and hit me in the head. But there's a whole bunch of them. Okay. But it is a way for the leader to go directly to the people, have a personal relationship with you and your friends and your families, and you can send their information, their quote unquote information around endlessly. Okay. And there's no fact checking within the system. There's not a press or experts going, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. It's the same method that was being used in the 1930s, updated with new technologies. And if you look at this graph, by the end of 2019, Mr. Trump was tweeting over 900 times a month. That's 30 times a day. Whoa. That's a lot of tweets, people. Endless bombardment of so-called truth and so-called information. Again, using the techniques of disinformation and propaganda that have been polished over time. And the goal? To destroy the truth. Donald Trump was asked by Leslie Stahl, one of TV's leading reporters, why do you continue to bash the press after you've been elected? This is a direct quote. You know why I do it? I do it to discredit you all and demean you all so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. I ask you to sort of let that into your heart and mind and go, oh my gosh, how upfront and naked is this? He didn't say, because you're constantly lying. He's saying, because I want to make sure that no one's going to believe you, regardless of what the facts are.
Okay, Mark, this is unscripted. This is, I can't believe he actually, I can believe, I'm astounded by that. Absolutely. Wow.
Everybody who sees this quote should be astounded. And we can, afterwards, I can get you the source for it. I didn't make it up. Okay.
Well,
But the point
I
being,
certainly believe you, Mark.
yeah, the point is that every one of the quotes that I'm using have been said in public and are documented, but they get lost in the blizzard of information so that, nobody remembers this unless you go back and dig into the historical record. But when my blood runs cold when I see this quote. Oh my God, well, who are we supposed to depend on then? If the press is destroyed because they're all a bunch of liars anyway, or the truth tellers, researchers who've done years of work on various issues, they don't have credibility. So to quote a Russian who is a dissident there and a propaganda expert, the goal isn't to sell an ideology or a vision of the future. Instead, it is to convince people that the truth is unknowable, so you need to follow a strong leader. Well, think about what has been going on for at least the past 5 years, where it's been very naked and very in our face. But the propaganda that I am describing to you about both divide and conquer and the assault on voting rights has been going on long before Donald Trump showed up. So I would say to each and every one of you, don't assume this is just a quote unquote Trump problem. This is embedded in the country in which we live. I guess I would just ask a question at this point in time. Am I making sense? And if the answer is yes, go to the chat box and just type in yes. And then I'll ask Tracy to report out when we get to the third section. So, annihilate the truth. This is again a picture of the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. 8 senators and 139 representatives voted to overturn the election results. There was no evidence of fraud produced. In fact, there were 60 lawsuits in front of many judges that were appointed by President Trump and a Supreme Court that had a majority that were appointed by Republican presidents, who basically said in every case except one minor case in Pennsylvania that there was no evidence of meaningful voter fraud. Zippo. It doesn't stop the big lie at all, because it is a strategy that has been developed and is being used to this day. So let's get back to some upbeat news here. In 2020, as I said earlier, we defeated the voter suppressors and expanded voting rights. In these dark colored states, you could vote by mail and you automatically were sent a ballot. In all of these medium colored, like Minnesota, you can vote by mail and you'll automatically get an application, okay? And then these other states, you can vote by mail. It was more difficult. You had to go get an application. It was a more difficult process, not the automatically being sent the opportunity to do so. And then a few states, you need an excuse to do it. Just these few states in the South and Indiana. This was a huge victory that helped produce the highest percentage turnout of a presidential election in 120 years. We should be celebrating that as a triumph of democracy. Again, with no evidence of any serious voting fraud. But here we are in March of 2021. The battle is raging as we speak. 47 states, there have been 361 bills introduced to restrict voting. 47 states. It's not going to work in all of them, but it's going to work in some key states that are going to make the 2022 and 2024 elections very challenging. There were 47 states where there were 843 bills to expand voting rights. So obviously in a lot of states, you got people putting in bills to expand voting rights and at the same time to restrict them. So battles are raging across the country. And I suspect that in every one of the 6 states in the 4th district, you've got this going on. And I say to each and every one of you, we need to get active. Our future, our movement, the well-being of your family and your communities depends on these fights. Because if we lose these voting rights fights and the ballot becomes more and more difficult to get, it doesn't look good for the future. This is not a game. This is America that we live in and love. And let's go to Georgia, because I spent a lot of time, David Ralston, the speaker back in April last year, saying this is a disaster for us. And then they say in the Senate, as soon as we can get into office, we're going to do something about this. Well, they passed a bill. It's called SB 202. And they made a whole set of voting law changes that are going to make it more difficult to vote. Okay. And one of the things they did in this bill, believe it or not, it is now a crime in Georgia to give food or water to people waiting to vote. Look at this line. Now, living in Washington State, where we have all mail voting, this looks like something out of like a horror movie. Like, what is this about? I mean, I'm sure Tracy has some of the similar feelings of like, we don't have this. We have 3 weeks to vote. We can do it in our living room, in our dining room. And we can study the ballot, study the voters pamphlet that we get from the state or the county. And so imagine you're a 90-year-old disabled lady and you're standing in line for 90 minutes and it's hot out. And somebody comes up and gives you a bottle of water. It's a crime. What could possibly be the purpose of this? I'm not making this up. Okay? This is deliberately focused and the many other ways of making it more difficult to vote in Georgia. Same thing's going on in Florida, in Arizona, in Michigan, a lot of these battleground states where the elections are narrow. You don't have to take the right to vote away from everybody, but you can take a vote away from enough people who are not going to vote your way to make sure you stay in office. Lindsey Graham was talking about it when I quoted him earlier. I think it's pretty clear that the enemies of the truth in our democracy are not going to stop. The question is, what are we going to do about it? How do we educate and mobilize people and help them become more effective in being able to talk to people that they work with, that they live with, that they're married to, that are in their families, in their churches, in their unions, about this is the truth here. And we can't allow ourselves to buy into endless disinformation and big lies. Well, Dolores Huerta, this is her quote, she's one of my heroines. She's about 90 years old now. She came out of the fields of California, helped found the United Farm Workers Union back in 1965. She was, she's old. She's been around. She's never given up, never stopped. And she said, every moment is an organizing opportunity. Every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. So each and every one of you who are already active in the IBEW, but every one of your members can be someone who uses every moment as an organizing opportunity. They can become an activist and they can be talking to people if they're educated. And what do I argue we need to do? We have to educate, inspire, we have to listen, and we have to motivate, and we have to organize for our rights. As I'm sure many of you know, the PRO Act, which is the latest opportunity to have major positive labor law reform, is in the US Senate right now. And the battle is on. And if we win that, we may have a huge opportunity to build our ranks and strengthen our movement. At the same time, there is the HR 1, which is For the People Act, which is about expanding and strengthening voting rights in all 50 states under federal law. These two huge pieces of legislation hang in the balance. And if we win them, the future is going to look brighter. If we lose them, it's going to get tougher. So I quote Dr. King, because he's certainly one of my inspirations. You know, as many of you may know, he was assassinated at a strike in 1968 of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. He died speaking up for labor and their right to organize in a state where they didn't have a right to organize a union in the public sector. But he said the labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. The captains of industry did not lead this transformation. In fact, they resisted until they were overcome. It was us, it was our ancestors who made things better and led the fight. It wasn't the billionaires, it wasn't the multimillionaires, it wasn't the Koch brothers, it wasn't Mark Zuckerberg's or Henry Ford, it was our ancestors who did it. We didn't do it perfectly, we made mistakes, but the history is clear. And if he could say that in 1961, we need to say this in 2021 and own it and make it happen. Because we're the biggest movement in the country that is fighting for a more just and equitable country. And we're also a very diverse movement. These are things we should be proud of as we fight forward. And we're not fighting just for ourselves, we're fighting for a better America. This is another one of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, a famous African-American poet. People don't always remember what you say or even what you do, but they always remember how you make them feel. Okay? And so as we approach people in our communities, in our unions, in our workplaces, how we approach them around this very complicated and difficult issue of what is the truth and what does it mean and what do we do? We need to remember Maya Angelou's quote, they always remember how you make them feel. Okay? It is a foundational starting point for creating more effective dialogue and civil discourse and the ability to respect each other even while we may disagree. To learn how to disagree in an agreeable way, or in a non-confrontational, hostile way. So what do I say we need to do? I argue we need to build a big movement of unionists and our family and our friends and our allies and our communities that are truth tellers, okay? Effective truth tellers. But what are the key elements of those? We got to be skilled about how to do it. We have to understand disinformation better. We have to be respectful of the people we were talking to. We have to be empathetic, even though we may strongly disagree with them. We've got to bring it from a loving and kind place. That doesn't mean we have to agree, but it can't come from anger and hatred or contempt. We need to be willing to listen to people and see if we can find common ground with them, things that we can work on together. We need to be determined, and we need to be persistent. Every one of those adjectives are relevant to the approach that we bring to trying to move people back toward the truth, open up their hearts, and thereby open up their minds. Because if they're filled with fear or hatred, it is very hard for them to hear the truth, because they're scared, even if they don't maybe admit it right up front. So here are some themes about this kind of work, and this is what I want to do and talk about more when we get to the second workshop, which is how do we become more effective? These are teasers, if you will, because what we focused on here is describing the problem. Where did it come from? How does it work? We must be willing to learn how disinformation works. If we don't understand what our enemies are doing to us in this war for the truth, we are not going to be as effective as we need to be. The facts alone do not carry the day, particularly if someone's heart or mind is closed. We have to have open hearts and minds. And we have to be able to remain calm. Even when people are saying things, it's like, oh my gosh, you have lost your mind. You are a flaming blank. We got to listen respectfully and patiently. Again, it doesn't mean we have to agree, but we have to try and find, is there a kernel of truth in what they're saying, even though their overall approach may be flawed in your opinion and not fact-based. We've got to look for common ground. Most of us are workers. Everybody in the IBEW is a worker, okay? You've got common ground right there. You want prevailing wage. You want project labor agreements. You don't want right to work. You want a healthy and safe workplace. You want an OSHA that's going to defend you on the job. You want the right to organize more workers and to build your strength, build your market share. And again, I can't stress how important it is not to lash out in anger or in contempt. Because if anybody picks up on that, the conversation is over. And winning an argument does not change people's hearts and minds. Engaging in a dialogue helps create the space to get people to perhaps rethink where they're coming from and their particular approach to a variety of issues. And most importantly, I think, acknowledge our common humanity. The vast majority of people that we know and we work with, we deal with, they're concerned about their families, they're concerned about their communities, they want a hopeful future. We all share that in common. But it's hard to move forward on those common hopes and dreams if we're yelling and screaming at each other and we can't hear each other and we don't have a way to engage in a more productive dialogue. And then obviously find issues to work together on, because you may disagree with somebody on 4 issues, but you find 2 to work on, and over time they may go, hey Tracy, hey Gary, hey Ralph, hey Joe, I really like the way you've been helping to lead this effort to make things better. That gives you more of an opportunity to engage people in, quote unquote, their crazy thinking in a kind way, where they have enough trust to maybe be able to change their hearts and minds. So these are all ideas about how we can be more effective in the work that we're doing. So Tracy, could you boot up the poll?
Be
Please.
my pleasure.
Okay.
We definitely want to hear folks weigh in on the poll. The poll is anonymous, and it's a simple question of yes or no answer. Did you find this workshop useful? Give you a couple more minutes to navigate the Zoom platform to make sure we capture everybody's answer. We have 80% of the participants have voted, Mark.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and shut the poll down?
Okay. Would you like me to share the results?
Yes, please.
It's unanimous amongst those who participated.
Good.
22 out of 29 participants believe that your workshop was useful. And we've got a couple of folks in the chat also. Linda Wenzel, who's a international lead organizer, says yes. Glenn Griffin says yes. So folks are following. I'm going to take this poll down.
Okay.
Because I think some other folks are moving on to your second bullet point of
Okay.
putting in the chat if it was useful, why and why not, and if they're interested in attending a workshop about
Yes.
how to defeat disinformation.
It's very important here to hear from you about you. Everybody who voted said it was useful. Give us some insight into why you think it was useful, and then Tracy and I will kind of mine your comments and talk about them a little bit. And then would you like to have a follow-up workshop about actually skill building around this? And the other thing I would ask is, do you know other places where I might do this workshop? Because I want to spread this all over the country. So why don't you take a couple of minutes and jot down a thought or a comment, and then we'll have a discussion.
So Mark, I think the general consensus from the participants is that they found your content and your workshop this morning to be incredibly insightful and helpful. And several folks have indicated that they're interested in more information from you, follow-up workshop, the skill building workshop, that definitely desire for more information, some thoughts that or some opinions saying that your presentation was very thought-provoking, breaking down the monumental threat of disinformation in simple terms. More accolades about the quality of your information and the quality of your approach to delivery. Additional thoughts about the information was incredibly useful on how propaganda can affect our brotherhood, our union, and our lives. And then this last comment from Brother Scott Smith, it helps make you understand why you think the way you do. And that was sort of, I know you heard me say this before in our previous conversations, but when I saw your workshop, this workshop for the first time in March, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, because I thought I might have been going insane because I was no longer able to discern what is reality in terms, what is truth, what is fact, and what is, disinformation, because I was being bombarded from, all angles with, propaganda and manipulative information. And I wasn't excited to learn what the source was, but I was excited to understand it wasn't because I was failing as a human being, right? This was a concerted, designed attempt, and it was achieving its goal, right? So and it feels that at least one participant, as I said, Scott Smith, seems to perhaps agree with or maybe Scott and I are on the same ground there.
Okay. So again, I would urge you, if you're interested in attending a workshop about how to defeat disinformation, write yes and put your name in, because I want to follow up. I want to talk with Gina Cooper and with Gary, from the 4th District about, okay, if there's interest, then how might this be done? I would point out, as Gary said earlier, I donate all my earnings from the 490 events that I've done over the past 9+ years. So this isn't about me making money. This is about me spreading the truth and what I call the union gospel. So if there's ways that I can be helpful to you in the 4th District or any other district in the IBEW, I want to do it. So we have a few minutes. What do you think about maybe opening up? So let me ask this question. What do you think about opening up the microphone for 5, 10, 15 minutes and letting people make some comments that are short so that other people have a chance to make comments, and we'll perhaps run a few minutes long. And then I can turn it back over to Gary to wind it up, say around 9:35 or 9:40. Would that work for you, Tracy, and for you, Gary?
It certainly works for me.
Absolutely.
Okay, then why don't you guys work your Zoom magic and open this up to comments, and we can have a verbal dialogue as well as a chat box dialogue. And then I'll make a couple of comments and then hand it to Gary to wrap up.
Very good. Let's do that, Mark. And if you would consider unsharing your screen, it would be easier for me. And if we want this to be as orderly as possible, if folks have some comments or questions that they want to engage you with audibly.
Can I just have people say, take a screenshot if you want? Oh, you already got that in the chat box.
Yep, but I can upload it again, your contact information. I'll do that right now.
And then I will stop the screen share. And I really want to thank Gary and Tracy for all the work they put into this to make this happen. So on a personal and a professional and a political level, thank you very, very much. You've been very, very helpful. So thoughts or comments from the group? We've got, probably 10, 12 minutes. If you want to share some ideas or feelings that you've had as a result of this webinar.
Mark, this is Troy Farrell with IBEW Local 972. Really appreciate you putting on this this training for us. I feel here in southeastern Ohio that the things that you're saying really to help explain the negativity towards the labor movement, the negativity towards us as leaders, and trying to educate our members on what's going on. It's easy for us to get into fights with people and get real emotional. And I'm going to say the one thing I've learned the most about from you is, I know I need to listen a little bit more and try to reason with people as opposed to just fighting with them all the time.
Winning a fight never changes anybody's mind. You may beat them. You didn't change their heart or mind.
Yes. Yeah.
Even though they piss you off, pardon my language.
Yeah. And it just drives negativity and division between us.
Yes. And your name again?
Troy Farrell.
Troy Farrell. Thank you, Troy.
Thanks.
Who else would like to share a comment or a thought?
Doug Giffen. Yeah, I've said for years how personal cell phone use and people having that ability in their hand not only divides their family view when they're talking amongst themselves, but gives it a more personal touch. And when the bad publicity stuff comes out from the other side, it hits those cell phones. Seems they have a better ability to divide and conquer us individually as opposed to groups that way also.
Yes. I was talking with a professor at the University of Washington who's an expert on disinformation, and she said, the internet is a big part of the problem, The internet is not the solution. The solution is face-to-face. The internet makes it easy to yell back and forth at each other. It's hard to have a calm, respectful conversation with someone unless it's face-to-face. Just a thought. Thank you. Thank you. Other thoughts or comments?
I have a thought on all of this. This is Linda Wenzel. I have struggled as a Christian Democrat, being beat over the head by the evangelicals on the political scene. And I have found comfort in the fact that while they can quote the Bible and claim to be biblical in their faith, they are not Christ-like. As a Christian, my model is Jesus, and I know there may not be, they may be different faiths on this, but to model my life after him means that I'm going to help the poor. I'm going to help the needy. I'm going to reach out to those that need lifted up, and that's the same values we have as a union. I also would point out at the same time that if we look back through the Bible and the Old Testament, and especially if we look at the book of Daniel, rather than wringing our hands and fretting so much over this, know that this is biblical. God has used leaders for his purposes, and it doesn't always end well for those leaders. It's just full of history that I see repeating itself as far as biblical things go, but the evangelicals can't seem to discern that. And just don't fret about your faith because you're a Democrat. Just dig into the word.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Other thoughts or comments? Let me ask this. Were there any aha moments where you went, oh my gosh, I never thought of that before, or like the light bulb went on? Were there any moments like that for any of you? I know Tracy told me that last time when I showed the use of the radio as the Nazi tool, as the new technology. She went, oh my gosh, the world got brighter or clearer. I don't remember your exact words, Tracy. Were there any moments like that for any of you? And if so, what were they? And the reason I ask is that the more I hear about statements like this, it helps me sharpen up my workshop. It's a way of continuous improvement, if you will.
I'd say several of the quotes that you shared with us, which some we've heard in a flash in the news or whatnot before, but revisiting some of the quotes really hit home for me.
Can you give a specific example? I appreciate you saying that. Does anything jump out at the moment?
Well, like the one where Tracy interrupted you for a second to comment on it. I mean, it's just unbelievable that ex-President Trump had the audacity to give that real answer that he gave.
Sometimes in the middle of big lies, big truths come out.
Good point.
Okay. And that's an example of like, hello, everybody. I'm not making this up. But we can't yell at people about it. I just saw a quote, I think, from Jamie about equating the internet with the radio. That's good. Thank you. Other aha moments or insights that you'd like to share that can help improve this work?
Perhaps it's lunchtime on the East Coast, Mark.
I used to say the most unenviable place to be a speaker is right before lunch. I don't want to get trampled. Well, hearing no more comments, Jamie just said bingo. You're playing bingo or you want to eat? Is that what you're telling
I
us?
think he wants to eat lunch.
Okay. I want to thank all of you for attending. As I said earlier, I would love to do this workshop in other places in the 4th District, but across the country, not just for the IBEW, for the building trades and the labor movement. I want to spread this word, and I also want to finish up this second workshop that gets at how do we develop greater skills in being more effective at combating this on a personal and individual as well as a group level. And again, thank you to Tracy, and thank you to Gary, and thank you to Vice President Gina Cooper for the opportunity to be here. Why don't I turn it over to Gary, and I'll sign off, and thank you for your comment, Linda.
Well, Mark, thank you. Thank everybody for joining us today. Hopefully you enjoyed it, but more importantly, hopefully it's stirred something in you to make you want to learn more and learn how we can take this information to help us address our issues. This is going to be made available if you guys would like to review it again. I know it's hard to catch everything the first time. I'm certainly going to watch it again. And if you have more input for Mark after you watch it a second time, and you'd like to share that with us, we'll certainly get it to Mark to help him with his follow-up. And I'm looking forward to part 2. So with that, unless Tracy, you have anything to add, once again, thank everybody for joining us. And with that, we'll close off. But Tracy?
Thank you, Gary. My final thought is please share with International Vice President Cooper our gratitude for being a part of the 4th District Progress Meeting. It's a pleasure to be with my sisters and brothers of the 4th District, and just continue to be safe. And I'm going to steal a line from Mark, which is stay positive, test negative, get vaccinated.
Nice.
If I could add one final comment. I just see a statement from Scott Smith from 1347. Every trade unionist needs to see this presentation. I say to you, Scott, and everybody you know, help figure out a way to get me in front of more groups of unionists anywhere. This problem we're fighting is going to keep going on. We got to get better and smarter to win. So thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much, Tracy. Have a great day. Have a safe, well, I guess you don't have to drive home because you're probably already there. But be well, and thank you very, very much.
Take care, everyone.
Gary
Thanks,
and Tracy,
Tracy.
could you stay on for a second?
Sure.
It would be my distinct pleasure. So I'm going to stop the recording.